Snow still clung to the roots of the sycamores as the Lenape returned to Gnadenhutten. It was March, 1782. Cold winds swept through the Ohio frontier, and silence hung heavy over the abandoned village. The Christian Lenape, Delaware Indians who had converted under Moravian missionaries, came not in defiance, but out of desperation. They'd been driven out the previous autumn by American militia and British-aligned warriors alike, forced to flee from the only home they'd known. Now, months later, they returned to their mission settlement, not to reclaim it, but to retrieve corn they'd left behind. Their children were starving. The village lay frozen in time. Tools still lay beside doorways. The church, once alive with hymns in Lenape and German, stood empty. And yet, even in exile, they had remained committed to peace. These were not warriors. They were families, believers, farmers, converts who still followed the sermons of men like David Zeisberger and John Heckewelder, though the missionaries themselves had been taken away. But just as the villagers began to harvest what little remained of their crops, word spread that a mounted force was approaching. It was the Pennsylvania militia, nearly 160 men, led by Captain David Williamson. The soldiers were raw from brutal frontier warfare. Many had lost family to violent raids by native warriors. Blinded by rage, they made no distinction between enemies and innocents. To them, all Indians were the same. The Lenape were gathered without resistance. There were 96 of them, men, women, and children. They explained they had no weapons, no allegiance to the British, and no part in the violence. They begged to be spared. But the soldiers held a vote, and the decision was made to kill them all. That night, the Lenape were divided into two houses, one for the men and boys, another for the women and children. They were given time to prepare for death. Inside the small cabins, the condemned prayed. They sang softly in Lenape and German, forgiving their killers aloud. Some tied handkerchiefs over their children's eyes. Others knelt with open Bibles. There was no resistance, only sorrow. At sunrise, March 8th, the killings began. The soldiers entered the cabins with mallets and hatchets. They moved methodically, bludgeoning and butchering every soul they found. Blood soaked the floors, children screamed, and still, no one fought back. By the end, 96 people were dead. 39 were children. The militia looted what they could, set fire to the buildings, and returned to Pennsylvania claiming a victory. There were no consequences, no trials, no remorse, only silence. News of the massacre spread slowly. The American Revolution was nearing its end, and few outside the frontier paid attention. George Washington never mentioned it publicly. Congress did not investigate. The bodies were left buried in a single mass grave. The surviving Moravian missionaries were devastated. So too were the Lenape who hadn't returned that spring. For many, Gnadenhutten became the moment faith gave way to fury. Peaceful coexistence now felt impossible. Some joined rising resistance movements. Others simply disappeared into the shadows of history, broken, hunted, and forgotten. Years passed, the land healed over. A new village rose near the site, and the memory of the massacre faded from public view. It wasn't until 90 years later, in 1872, that a tombstone was erected over the mass grave. It read, "Here triumphed in death 90 Christian Indians, March 8th, 1782. But there was no triumph in that cabin, only the echo of prayers and the sound of hammers. Today, the Gnadenhutten Massacre is remembered not as a battle, but as a betrayal. A massacre committed not in war, but in vengeance. The victims were not warriors, they were believers, and they died with hymns on their lips. The fields are quiet now, the mission long gone, but the silence still speaks, and history does not forget. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.